I'm doing fine too, so thank you for asking. Okay, let's just rock it. Okay, you guys, let's do it. Next section of the book, the happy part. I'm going to put a handout on the screen. This section, the happy section, has it's a pretty simple design. There's 3 stories where they get out the Torah and read from it in public together. This is somewhat similar to Nehemiah himself is here to bring the Torah to all of the people. And then here he finally does it. So this is, these are the first stories of expository preaching in the Bible. Did you know that? It's the first stories of expository preaching. Yeah, right here. Here, let's just read them. Let's just read it. Nehemiah 8. So all the people gathered as one man in the square in front of the water gate, and they asked Ezra the scribe to bring the book. When you read the word book in your Bible, don't ever think this technology right here. What was the form of books? Scrolls, yeah. So this is a this technology is being innovated around the time of the early Jesus movement, and then became a widespread. We're talking about scrolls. So he brings the scroll of the Torah of Moses, which the Lord had given to Israel. Ezra the priest brought the Torah before the men and the women, over all who could listen with understanding. Even the kids are there. On the first day of the 7th month, he read from it before the square, which was in the front of the water gate, from the early morning until midday. It's like hours. He was reading the Torah in the presence of the men and women, those who could understand. Everybody was locked on. Just like what would happen at your church, I'm sure. Yeah, right. So Ezra the scribe stood at a wooden podium, the first pulpit, which they made for the purpose. And beside him was a whole bunch of Levites on his right, a bunch of Levites on his left. He opened up the scroll in the sight of the people. He was standing a bit higher. When he opened the scroll, everybody stood up. And he blessed the Lord, the great God, and all the people said, Amen, Amen, truth, truth. While lifting up their hands, they bowed low, they worshiped with their faces to the ground. And then after what exactly is happening is kind of hard to piece together, but it seems like Ezra does this reading, a section of reading, and then these Levites go out and explain the law to the people in their place. That's what he says. And so they read from the book, the scroll from the Torah, translating or breaking it down section by section to give the sense so that they understood the reading. So what seems to be is then there's also the first small group Bible study. So it's like Ezra does this reading, and it doesn't say that they're arranged in little smaller groups, but that seems to be the idea, because then it's all these Levites who are in Ezra's cohort, and then they are helping explaining the section that they just read to this group of people in their place. You get the scene here? They just do it. They do this for 7 days in a row. Here in Nehemiah chapter 8. It's remarkable. Yes?
You think it's significant that he began to read on the Feast of Trumpets?
Yes. Yeah, the fact that this is all happening in the 7th month is the first day of the 7th month. Yes, yeah. Rosh Hashanah. Right. Yes. And where, yeah, that's right. Did I have anything about that in the notes? I don't think I did. No.
Leviticus 23.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so in the modern Jewish calendar, they call these the days of wonder, the days of awe. It corresponds roughly to our October, because you have the Feast of Trumpets on the 1st, then on the 10th you have the Day of Atonement, And then just a week after that, you have the 7-day feast of Sukkot, of Tabernacles. And so just like the way that in American culture, we have the holidays, which are Thanksgiving and Christmas and New Year's, this is like that. And so everything shuts down in Israel. It's really inconvenient, actually. If you're living, the grocery store is shut down, and you can't get leavened bread anywhere. Anyway, it's really complicated. So all the same, yes, this is very intentional. It's the 7th month. This is the month that they're going to retell the Trumpet Blast, which is connected to the giving of the Torah on Mount Sinai, and then the journey through the wilderness, which they retell in Tabernacles. Yes, absolutely significant. So here's the response of the people. Now, Nehemiah was the governor then. Ezra, the priest and the scribe, the Levites, they're teaching the people, saying, "Today is a holy day to the Lord your God. Don't mourn or weep." For the people, when they heard the scroll of the Torah, they just were weeping. They're weeping. Then he said to them, "Go, get some really fat animals and slaughter them and have a party. Drink of the sweet wine. Send gifts to those who have nothing prepared. This is a holy day for the Lord. Don't be grieved." And then this famous line. Did you know this is where it comes from? "The joy of the Lord is your strength." Now this is interesting. Every English translation that I can find in Nehemiah 8:10 has the joy of the Lord is your strength. NIV, ESV, New American Standard, NRSV, King James. But I'll just show you. This isn't difficult to do. The joy of the Lord, that's not a difficult phrase, but this word strength right here, it's a very common Hebrew word. And I'm just going to show you the standard dictionary entry. It's ma'oz, and its standard meaning is refuge. I mean, this word occurs so many times in the Old Testament. And the only time it's translated strength is this time. If you look at every other occurrence of this Hebrew word in the Bible, it's translated refuge, protection, shelter, fortress. Now, let me just ask you, and I have this here in the notes, is the joy of the Lord is your refuge? Does that have a different feel to it than the joy of the Lord is your strength? Yes. So I love our modern English translations. They're such a gift. They're so incredible. But there are times where I don't understand why the committees have done what they've done. And this is unfortunately one of those times. And all I can think is it's kind of like the beginning of the Lord's Prayer, like hallowed be your name. What's hallowed? Who says hallowed anymore? Like just blessed. It means blessed. It's an English translation. Let's translate into normal English. Blessed, not blessed, made holy, recognized as holy, instead of hallowed. So this is another one of those. I don't know. Okay, here's why I'm going into all this detail. The people hear the words of the Torah and they start crying. Why do you think they cry? Yeah, I mean, things aren't going well. Remember this scene? They're like really breaking the Torah, right? And lending with interest to each other. How did they end up in Babylon in the first place? That they're back here, and how did all this happen? Through breaking the terms of the covenant. And then they hear the Torah, which has all the terms of the covenant in it, and what's their reasonable response? It's grief, like, oh my gosh, we've done this to ourselves. So that's a natural response. But what's the response of Ezra and the Levites? Is they say, you guys, don't weep. Don't weep. This is a holy day to the Lord. The joy of the Lord is your protection. which leads to the next question about this phrase, the joy of the Lord. Just like when Paul says the love of Christ compels us. Is he referring to his love for Christ? Or is he referring to Christ's love for him? And different commentators line up on different sides of that one. The joy of the Lord. Is this your joy in the Lord? Or is this the Lord's joy over you? How you doing? So yeah, exactly. Yeah, preaching terms, this is a gospel moment. This is hearing the Torah read aloud exposes their compromise and their failures, and so they weep. And in one sense, that's a reasonable response. But then in another sense, it's not a reasonable response because what it shows is a lack of awareness of God's posture towards me when I fail. And God's posture towards his people is joy. So the classic one that your grandma loved to cross-stitch and put on her wall is Zephaniah 3:17, spoken to the people as they're about to go into exile. That the Lord your God is in your midst, a victorious warrior. He will exult over you with joy. He will be quiet with his love. He will rejoice over you with shouts of joy. So while God will bring justice, to be true to his character, his ultimate covenant purposes are to forgive and to rejoice over his people when they turn to him. I think it's exactly what's going on here. So man, this will preach like nothing else. But it involves a moment where you have to address a translation issue. And those are tricky, right? You have to be wise for how often you do that, because you don't want people to feel like they have to be, whatever, Bible nerds. Well, you do want them to be Bible nerds, but you know what I'm saying. They don't have to know Hebrew to read their Bible. But at the same time, you do want to guide them to they're reading a translation. And sometimes those translations make choices, and sometimes you disagree with those choices. And so I think that's also good to put that on the radar of people in our church communities. But man, this is a really cool story that I think you kind of have to address. So they get out the Torah. They read from the words of the covenant. And yeah, that's well said. This is a gospel moment. The covenant exposes both their failure and God's joy in forgiving and creating a new future for his people. That's what they celebrate here. How you guys doing? Yeah, it's good stuff. Then they celebrate Sukkot. If you wanted, you could do a class or a teaching where you all bring palm branches and you build little huts. Or not, whatever you want, make them in the backyard. But this is very similar to this here, of rebuilding your identity through these rhythms, of worship rhythms. Sukkot was an act of worship, building these huts. It's very similar to eating the Passover meal. It's doing these tactile practices that retell the story of who we are as God's people. Another moment here is Nehemiah 9, this incredible prayer. Oh man, this prayer is exquisite. It's a long poem that goes from verse 5 all the way through. Look how long it is, you guys. It's really long. It goes all the way down to verse 37. And it's a little mini Old Testament theology. And it's all of the people, after they've soaked themselves in the Torah, the Levites get up and they lead the people in this corporate confession. And I think, in the notes I have some observations. It's all elaborately arranged in the symmetrical kind of ring structure. And at the very center of it is a petition for, let's just read it. Now, therefore, our God, the great, the mighty, the awesome God who keeps his covenant and loving kindness. Don't let all of this hardship be insignificant before you. The hardship that's come upon us, upon our kings and princes, our priests, our prophets, our fathers, upon all our people from the days of Assyria to this day. That's it. We're back in the land, and it's lame. It's hard. It's not working. The Persians charge really high taxes. People aren't following the Torah. So look upon us. And then in these outer rings here, first they retell the whole story of Israel and say, those are our ancestors. And then on this side of the petition, they say, and we're pretty much just like our ancestors. So they fully identify with the sin of their ancestors. And then they end, look at how the prayer ends. Look at this. Behold, we are slaves today. We're slaves. Where are we back? So we're, in terms of the prayer, we're putting ourselves, nothing's really changed. Well, one thing has changed. What land are we sitting in? Well, we're not in Egypt. We're in the land that you gave to our fathers, but now we're slaves in the land. And all the abundant produce that you said would come when we obey the Torah, now we have to give it as taxes to the kings that you set over us because of our sins. They rule over our bodies, our cattle, as they please. We are in great distress. So what are we going to do? Everybody, let's pull up our bootstraps, and we're going to agree in writing. We're all going to follow the Torah from now on. Here's the list of everybody who signed the agreement. And then they give this short kind of summary. Here's all of the ways that we've been breaking the Torah, and here's what we're going to do about it. We're not going to marry non-Israelites anymore. We're going to start up paying the tithes again. We're going to support the Levites. We're going to celebrate the feasts. We're going to do it, everybody. We're going to do it. And you're like? Yeah, okay. So there's a movement here that's awesome about the reading of the Torah and their response. It might be worth exploring if there's a message or a teaching here about the nature of corporate confession, about the role that, whether this sounds high church or Catholic or whatever to you, I'm not sure, but it's biblical. There is some kind of value of taking time to own the sins that we ourselves may not have, committed, but that we participate in because we're a part of the family. Or we ourselves live in a situation where we benefit from the sinful decisions of others, or we live in the wake of the sins of our ancestors that still shape what the situation we're sitting in today. How you guys doing? I wonder if the Bible's relevant. Right? So there's a value to this kind of thing. It makes us aware that we're a part of a bigger story. It makes us aware that me and my own personal story and my own moral failures, they're very significant, but they aren't the center of the universe. Like also I'm a part of these systemic issues of sin that ruin everything around us. And we need to be just as aware of that as a community as my own personal moral accountability before God. That's what's going on here. This is good stuff. Okay. But in the interest of time, we're moving forward. Okay. Are you guys doing all right? I'm just rocking. Okay, all right. So there, in the notes, there's some cool things about the design of the prayer. Oh, yeah, just read the prayer. It's really beautiful, and it's really cool. So they make this agreement. The agreement that they make is to obey 7 specific laws of the Torah. And I've given you a lot of notes here, and the reason is these represent the same kind of thing that Ezra was doing with the Torah in Ezra chapter 9. So you have a lot of the laws in the Torah address Israel as a nation living in their own land with a temple government structure. And that's not their situation anymore. It's just a different political setting. It's a different social setting. And so each of these 7 laws are the result of Ezra or the Levites taking a law from the Torah and doing more of interpretation and then applying the principle of it or the spirit of it to their own circumstance. And it's not thrilling stuff. It's kind of like about how much wood gets supplied for the altar for the daily offering and stuff like that. It's not thrilling. But it's what you see is it's people, once again, reading their Bibles and saying, there's wisdom here for how we obey God faithfully in our generation, even though the Torah doesn't address it specifically. It's that same process at work. And it's really interesting to read through. So I give you a bunch of stuff there if you want to nerd out on that. Because I'm sure you woke up today wondering, how was the wood supplied to the right? Anyhow, what were the laws concerning tithes for the Levites? What was that exactly? So it's actually really interesting, I think. Okay, here's how the section ends. The happy section ends with a really, really happy part. Here's what Nehemiah does. His walls are finished. He finished the walls, they read the Torah, the temple's built, they're gonna have the final party. And so here's what he does, this is great. At the dedication of the wall of Jerusalem, they sought out Levites from all their places, everybody come, that they might celebrate the dedication with gladness, hymns of thanksgivings, cymbals, harps, lyres, all these ancient instruments, right, that you love to play. So what he does is he gets 2 choirs, and they start at the section of the wall opposite the temple, and he sends 1 choir of Levites marching and singing to march along the wall this direction, and then he sends another choir to go this direction, and then they're going to meet right at the wall section in front of the temple. Such a cool symbolism. They encircle the whole city with praise to the God of Israel. And then they finally meet up. The 2 choirs meet up in front of the temple. I took the officials with me. We blast some trumpets. We offer sacrifices. God's given everybody great joy, so that the joy of Jerusalem was heard from afar. And what's happening, this is the last phrase, I call it joy. The last phrase of this, that little line right there, corresponds verbatim to what happened at the party when they dedicated the temple here, and what happened when they dedicated the altar here. It says, God gave them great joy, and they played musical instruments, and they sang. God gave them great joy, they played music instruments, and they sang. God gave them great joy, and everybody around heard it, and they were full of joy. Joy, joy. Hooray, right? This is great. I knew this would work out, right? And just for a mental exercise, what if the book of Ezra-Nehemiah ended right there? What effect would that have on you, and what would you think is the message of this book?
How to construct a revival.
Yeah, sometimes it works out, And it was hard, but we did it, didn't we? I mean, how else would you read it? We came across difficulty and opposition, compromise from within, problems from without, but we bound ourselves to the Torah, reminded ourselves of God's grace, and we had a party.
We're the hero.
What's that?
We're the hero.
Yeah, totally. I mean, in one way, that would be a more satisfying story to read, wouldn't it? It would be. So, I just want to let the effect of the book's conclusion, I just want to kind of read it together in light of everything we've done, and you'll just see how it works. It starts in 1244. On that day, men were also appointed over the chambers for the storerooms, where the contributions and the first fruits and the tithes, to gather them from the fields of the cities by the portions required by the law for the priests and Levites. So you may not have known this. Well, maybe you do. The temple, when Solomon's temple had all these storerooms dotting the exterior, and then the courts had all these storerooms. Like when you bring the produce of your fields, where do those go? Like where do those get stored for the Levites to live off of them? So in these rooms. This is surely what Jesus is alluding to in John 14. In my Father's house are... Anyhow, just that one's for free. So it's all these storerooms, and so what they set them apart to be the rooms where all the new system, the new sacrificial system, all the Levites, everybody's gonna start tithing of their fields, so that all of the priests are well fed. It's gonna be awesome. They set it all up. The Levites are gonna perform worship for their God, for the service of purification, together with the singers, the gatekeepers, everything David and Solomon set up. Remember, everybody, hyperlink, in the days of David and Asaph, in ancient times, there were leaders and singers, songs of praise, hymns of thanksgiving, and so also, now in the days of Zerubbabel and Nehemiah, they gave portions for this. They have like these royal Levite choirs that just sing all day long in the temple. It's amazing. Now, on that day, they read aloud from the scroll of Moses in the hearing of the people. And there was found written in it, hyperlink Deuteronomy 23, no Ammonite or Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. Ammonites and Moabites have a common ancestral line from Lot. Do you remember that story? Right? It's the scandalous story. Alcohol, sex in a cave with your dad, not a good story. But that's what these nations are associated with in their origins. So, people from that family line were not ever supposed to enter the temple. Also because they didn't meet the sons of Israel with bread and water. These are the guys that hired Balaam. Remember that whole thing? But God turned that curse into a blessing. So they heard that law, and they excluded all non-Israelites from Israel. Oh. Okay. All foreigners from Israel, from Ammonites and Moabites. It's like two small people groups living on the east side of the Jordan River. And from that, they get no more non-Israelites. Huh. Now, prior to this, Eliashib the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of God, he was related to Tobiah, the guy who was constantly harassing Nehemiah. In fact, Eliashib, you know what he did for Tobiah? Ooh, you remember Tobiah's ethnicity? Okay. So they read about no Ammonites, but what they excluded was all foreigners. And then there's one Ammonite that they didn't exclude. And who didn't exclude an Ammonite? A priest. And in fact, not only did they exclude all these other people, they didn't exclude one Ammonite, Tobiah. And why didn't they exclude? Well, actually, they had given him one of those really nice storerooms as a temple, as a little Airbnb for him when he would come to town. And so instead of putting in the incense and utensils and the tithes of grain into that little room, Eliashib prepared it as a little special room just for Tobiah the Ammonite. This is all happening under Nehemiah's nose. Now, listen, Nehemiah says, I wasn't in Jerusalem when this happened. It was the 32nd year of Artaxerxes. I had gone to the king to run an errand. I wasn't there. And so after some time, I asked leave from the king. And so I came back to Jerusalem, and I learned about what Eliashib had done, giving him one of the rooms in the temple courts. It was very displeasing to me. So I threw out all of Tobiah's goods out of the room. Then I gave an order. And they cleansed the room, and I returned the utensils to the house of God with the grain offerings and the frankincense. Okay. But think, now we're casting this glance here. So the temple rooms are to be sanctified and set apart for the use of the Lord. And how seriously are people taking the sanctity of the temple? Yeah, not so much. Not so much. And a priest, no less. Then I also I started looking around in more of the temple rooms, and I discovered, there's nothing here for the Levites to eat. And so the Levites actually, and the singers, who are supposed to be here performing their service, they actually had to go away and get jobs so that they can feed their families. And so I reprimanded the officials, and I said, why is the house of God forsaken? So I got them together, restored them to their posts. All Judah brought the tithe of grain, the wine, the oil, and the storehouses. And so in the charge of the storehouses, I put Shelemiah the priest, and Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah, and the Levites. In addition to them was Hanan, the son of Zakur, Matanya. At least I trusted them. It was their task to make everybody else follow the rule. Oh Lord, remember me for this. Don't blot out my loyal deeds, which I've performed for the house. Now, in those days, I also saw in Judah, there was a bunch of people who were treading wine presses. They're making wine on the Sabbath. And they're loading in these sacks of grain, putting them on their donkeys, actually tons of produce, wine, grapes, figs, all these loads. They were bringing them to Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. What's the third of the 10 commandments? Sabbath. How respected is the Torah? Yes, well, not so much. So I reprimanded the nobles of Judah and said, what is this evil thing you're doing? You're defiling the Sabbath. Didn't your fathers do this? And look what God brought on us. And all this trouble, you are adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. And then as it grew dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, I said, shut those doors so that they don't open till after the Sabbath. I stationed some of my servants there so nobody could do that anymore. Once or twice, the traders and merchants of every kind of merchandise, they started spending the night outside the temple, or outside Jerusalem. They want to set up little markets. Now that the Israelites are going to be resting on the Sabbath, they start up their own little markets, right? It's very opportunist of them. And he says, stop, get away from the wall. And what was Nehemiah's main contribution? Rebuilding the wall. And then what happens to the sanctity of the wall? People are setting up shops there. So I told them, don't come here on the Sabbath anymore. I commanded the Levites to purify themselves, to sanctify the Sabbath day. Oh, remember me, my God. Have compassion on me by the greatness of your loving kindness. You know something else that happened in those days? I saw that there were all these Jewish people marrying women from Ashdod, from Ammon, from Moab, and their kids, half of them spoke the language of Ashdod. None of them spoke Hebrew, but rather the language of his own people. And so I contended with them. I cursed them. I started hitting people and pulling out their hair. I made them swear in the name of the God of Israel, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take of their daughters for your sons or for yourselves. Isn't this what Solomon, the king of Israel, did? Yet among many nations there was none like him. He was loved by God. God made him king over Israel, but these foreign women caused him to sin. Do we then hear about you that you've committed this great evil by acting unfaithfully, marrying foreign women? Even one of the sons of Jehoiada, the son of Eliashib the priest, that guy who made the little store Airbnb for Tobiah, he married the daughter of Sanballat, the other ultimate bad guy in this book. So he's goner. He's not a priest anymore. Remember them, oh my God. They've defiled the priesthood. They've defiled the covenant. So I purified everybody from everything foreign. I appointed the duties for the priests and for the Levites, everybody in his task. I arranged for the supply of wood, remember that wood, for the altar at the appointed times, and for the first fruits. Remember me, O my God, for good. How you doing? What on earth? Yeah. That's how the book ends. So just stop. Just so this would have been a very satisfying ending. So very clearly, we just systematically worked through every significant accomplishment in the book up to this point, and we just undid it. And Nehemiah kind of became a jerk, didn't he? Or, well, let's at least say he lost his temper, and he felt that the only effective way to communicate was through violent coercion, right? Like the wait for prayer and providence, Nehemiah has become you know what I'm saying here? Nehemiah himself has changed through this experience. And then that's how the book ends. So, a takeaway, so we're all the way back to my thought at the beginning. With this kind of ending, the book can't be promoting this as like your ticket to the next 5-year plan and how to carry it out in your ministry or whatever. Rather, this is like giving us an anatomy of the life of leadership in God's covenant people. Unless God's Spirit does something that we cannot ever coordinate, strategize, plan, or bring about, we're dead in the water. We're just a structure. But at the same time, if we don't maintain these structures and these rhythms to ground our identity in the covenant story, we will not be a people ready to receive revival when it comes, will we? And so the book doesn't tell you to do nothing and to give up leadership, but at the same time, the book does, I think, temper our utopianism for when we think about all of the great things that Jesus wants to accomplish through me and my thing, you know? So in that sense, it humbles us, and it puts us and our focus on just the promises of the faithfulness of God. How you doing? Let's see, what time is it? Okay. We could do, out of the 13 minutes left, probably take me 5 minutes to show you one more thing. But then also, I would be happy to do some Q&A. Can I show you one more thing? Okay, all right. So, oh yeah, here's my little chart of the end of the book. It's awesome. Look at it later. Okay, so remember this, Ezra 1. You remember how it began? With that big hyperlink to the book of Jeremiah. So dear reader, God moved the heart of the king of the nations to let the people return, to rebuild the temple, the prophetic package of hope, all of this. Could this be the fulfillment of the great promises? Could it be? As you start the book, could it be? It could be. Let's find out. Was it? No. Was it part of the story, a valuable part of the story, so valuable that it's built into the story of the scriptures themselves? Yes. So the partial fulfillment of this promise becomes a part of the scriptures themselves to teach us about what it means to be a hopeful people, despite the ebb and flow and the ups and downs. But what it remains is that, well, what about this? This promise of going to rebuild, and isn't this what the prophet said would happen? Now, in the structure of the Hebrew Bible, the 3-part shape of the Hebrew Bible, the ordering of the first 2 sections, the Torah, is fairly universal, just because of how the books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. the design and order of the prophets is fairly fixed in different manuscripts. The third section of the Ketuvim, or the writings, there are places you can go to survey how those books are arranged, the order of those books in different Hebrew manuscripts and collections. And what you'll find is there's a lot of variety. I mean, you look at the writings, look at that third section, and you tell me that's not kind of like that kitchen drawer that you have with the batteries and the twist ties and the rubber bands and the fork. You know what I mean? It's kind of like, well, there's wisdom literature, there's narrative, there's poetry, there's wisdom poetry, there's love poetry, there's lament poetry, and then there's those 3 narrative books at the end. But the fact that in many traditional orders, the Chronicles is the last book of the Hebrew Bible. Just stop and think about that. Where's Chronicles in our English ordering of the Bibles? What does it come after? It comes after Kings, which is why you never read it. Is it right? Because you're like, well, I just read Samuel and Kings. Why do I need to reread a retelling of and so you never read it, which is tragic. The Book of Chronicles, it tells you within itself by the date that it was written after Ezra-Nehemiah. It's written by an Israelite prophet historian who's living no more than 200, 300 years before Jesus. So he is retelling the story of, well, look at the first word. Look at the first word of the Book of Chronicles. Yeah? Look at the last paragraph of the Book of Chronicles. So the author of Chronicles is giving you an Old Testament theology of the whole thing. He begins with Genesis. He goes through, and the way that the chronicler, that's what he's called by Bible nerds, the chronicler, is the way he arranges the story is to highlight everything about David and the messianic promise to David and the rebuilding of the temple. And then how he ends the story is with the Edict of Cyrus. Now, so here's the edict. You already read it. You already know it from Ezra-Nehemiah. In the first year of Cyrus, the king of Persia, right, to fulfill the word of Jeremiah, the Lord stirred up Cyrus, the king of Persia. Here's the edict. Thus says Cyrus, the king of Persia, the Lord's appointed me to build him a house in Jerusalem, which is in Judah. Whoever there is among you of all his people, may the Lord God be with him, and let him go up. Now, in our English Bibles, what's the next thing you read? Ezra-Nehemiah. And what's the first thing that you read? And you're kind of like, hey, I just read that. But no, stop. There's a very important difference. Okay, what's the last sentence of the edict here? Do you see it? So the author of Chronicles has intentionally cut the Edict of Cyrus off mid-sentence. Mid-sentence. Are you with me? What could possibly be the purpose of that? So if Ezra-Nehemiah begins with all of these hyperlinks to the prophetic hope package, and then tells you a story, dear reader, the return of the exiles under Ezra and Nehemiah was not the fulfillment of these promises. And then the chronicler comes along and tells you the whole story of the Old Testament and brings you up right up to the moment of the Edict of Cyrus, and then cuts it off mid-sentence. And the last sentence is there anybody among the people of Israel that God is with him? And let him go up, and then the Old Testament ends. Come now. Do you get it? So someone has designed this whole thing to tell you that the fulfillment of the prophetic hope package is waiting its fulfillment. and that the real return from exile has not yet happened. The Ezra-Nehemiah wasn't it. And you read it and you're like, oh yeah, that totally was not it. And so the chronicler ends with that edict cut in half to launch you off into hope and expectation of the fulfillment into the future. And I'm not making this up. I could give you a whole list of Jewish scholars and all their quotes, who they all, like everybody recognizes this is what's happening. It's brilliant. It's literary ninjas. So once again, you have to factor this in to your reading of Ezra-Nehemiah. The book intentionally is trying to show you that things didn't go well. Why didn't they go well? We've looked at some of the reasons. But that doesn't mean it's, the book isn't just a downer. I think the book is realism. And so in that sense, it's true. Let me close with this. The book, I think, Ezra-Nehemiah does exactly the kind of thing that Paul said the scriptures do, which is they make you wise. They give you wisdom about the kind of salvation that we need and have received by giving our faith and allegiance not to ourselves and our 5-year plan, but to the Messiah, Jesus, who did for us what we could never do for ourselves. How you doing? There you go. I mean, how is that not the book of Ezra-Nehemiah? Yeah. So there you go. That was my little ski jump at the end. Would it be fruitful to have some Q&A to round it out? Great. Hey. Yeah, Daniel. Oh, dude. Yeah, Daniel. So the question is, how does Daniel set this up? So Daniel is sitting at the 70 years almost being finished, and he's wondering if the events are going to be fulfilled in his days, if he's going to see the fulfillment of the prophetic hope package. And it precisely corresponds to, and then you go, oh yeah, maybe, is this it? No, it's not it. And then Daniel, all of a sudden, that conversation he has with the angel that says, yeah, actually it's not 70, it's 70 times 7, it's going to be a lot longer. So Daniel itself already prepared you to read Ezra-Nehemiah as not the ultimate fulfillment. Yeah, it's a good question. Other thoughts? Yeah.
They rebuilt the temple. Why are the prophets, the post-exilic prophets, really pushing them to rebuild the temple if this isn't where we find the fulfillment of the New Covenant hope?
Oh, well, I think the question is why all the emphasis on rebuilding the temple if it wasn't the ultimate fulfillment? Well, don't confuse the author's perspective with the perspective of the people in the story themselves. So they didn't have the luxury of the next 2 centuries of history that the author of Ezra-Nehemiah had to be like, yeah, this was definitely not the fulfillment.
They're prophets.
Yeah, that's right. Yes. Yeah, and the primary goal of the prophets was not to look into crystal balls. It was to keep people faithful to the covenant and to speak on God's behalf. And to, every time there's failure, to keep projecting out future hope because of God's faithfulness. But yeah, they're not prophets in the sense of they know everything to come in the future. And yeah, that's a different prophet, a different kind of prophet. Yeah, good question. Yeah.
Can you identify any Persian influence on the literary style at all?
There's lots of Persian vocabulary, like straight up loan Persian words that are spelled with Hebrew letters. And you can always tell because they have Hebrew words tend to be kind of short. And you can always tell when you have a loan word in Hebrew because it's 14 letters. It's impossible to pronounce. So there's a lot of that going on. But in terms of the narrative style, the literary style, it's just in the sweet spot of Hebrew Bible narrative, Old Testament narrative. Yep. Yeah. Good question.
You talked about all the providential details in Nehemiah 2 that led to the favor that he had with
Mm-hmm.
the king. You didn't include the queen being there
Oh.
significant of like, oh, he's in a good mood because he wanted to impress his wife.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, the little detail about, and the queen was sitting there. Some people, I don't think the chronology works. Some people think that's a little subtle hyperlink to Queen Esther. But I think it's off by almost 100 years, so I don't think it really works. But there are some people who, think that might be what's going on. Other people think it's just a literary clue to mean that he was in the king's private chamber and having a private conversation with him. But one way or another, the point is he ends up with a private audience with the king, and the only person around is the queen, and he has this kind of intimate moment of sharing why he's feeling so bad. So I do think it's a relevant detail to say it's not like with all the servants around the fanfare. This is a private moment with the king and his wife. Yeah. Which, how often did that happen in his career, Yeah.
Of the minor prophets, who was preaching in Israel at that time? In Judah?
Well, the only ones named are Haggai and Zechariah. But then the book of Malachi, the kinds of situations that Malachi addresses seem to fit perfectly into this. He talks about the neglect of the temple, how the sacrifices they offer are really lame and sick, and the Levites have no financial support. So within Malachi, it makes sense that he's within the period of Nehemiah. He's just not mentioned in the story. It's a good question. Yeah. 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 Yep. Yeah. There's a little detail about the first guy who's a leader, Sheshbazzar. He gets very little airtime in the story, but he's a descendant of the line of David. And then Zerubbabel is also. But what's interesting is while the Israelites were allowed to go back, after the exile, it was the priests who were appointed as the leaders. And it makes sense because kings would be a direct, a rival to the kings of Persia. So from this period forward in Israel's history, there were no more kings except the Maccabean revolt, when Hanukkah, if you know the story of Hanukkah. But other than that, the priests kind of became like the governor. And that was still happening in Jesus' day. So like Caiaphas is essentially the number one person in the land. But they were aware of the line of David. The records are kept. Jesus' family kept those records, Joseph and so on. But it seemed like it was maybe almost dangerous to be from the line of David because that means you're a potential threat. So that just it's not a significant theme in this storyline, at least. Yeah.
You mentioned that the Chronicles was written about 200 or 300 BC or so.
Yes.
What are the indicators? How do they what's the time?
Yeah, you have to study the genealogies in the first 9 chapters of Chronicles, and if you just follow it down, the line of David, the line of Judah, David's family, and then the high priestly line continues past Nehemiah, and it goes a number of generations past Ezra-Nehemiah, which means that the author had to be sitting at least after those generations. So it's relative. That's why it's about 100 years, somewhere between 200 to 300 is where the chronicler's doing his homework. Yeah. Yeah.
Been loving this. I just have a question. I know sometimes we can, with alliteration, go too far. You see Jesus as a better Nehemiah. When it says
Oh.
this is a cupbearer, Jesus goes with lumber to rebuild Jerusalem with the cross. You see that?
Yeah, maybe not so much the lumber, the lumber part, the lumber foreshadowing the cross. But I do think all of these characters, the way that Ezra is a new Moses, the way that Nehemiah is a new Joshua, this is how the biblical authors work. So all 4 of the Gospels are intentionally creating a portrait of Jesus as a new Moses, as a new Joshua. And he even says, as one greater than Solomon, the greater Solomon, greater than the temple. So Jesus himself read the Hebrew Bible with all of these characters as becoming these like archetypes or portraits pointing forward to someone who would come and bring all of this to its fulfillment. So I do think, like, go for that stuff. But that's the stuff I think we can anchor in what the authors themselves were actually trying to accomplish. Once we get into the lumber symbolizing, it's kind of like, yeah, it preaches, or the cup, but I just am never sure if I'm making it up. And so I tend to like not emphasize that kind of stuff. But that's just my, spirit can work through all kinds of ways. Yes?
I think Nehemiah was just, it was a revelation of his humanity.
At the end. That's true.
You look at his first prayer in chapter 1, and he really included himself in the sin of the nation of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Now back here, it's just like when everybody else hill is going to hell, save your own hill. And he enumerated to God, remember these good things about me, but I can't justify what Israel.
Yeah, I think his 3 remember me's at the end, I don't think we're meant to take those as like self-serving. He's a man whose heart burns for the fulfillment of the promises of God. But he obviously, he loses composure. And in a way that he didn't earlier. Like he was a model of reserve and patience earlier, and he just lost it here at the end. And so he's human. Yeah, that's a good point.
So along with Haggai and Zechariah, we're not saying that the temple and the walls were necessarily a completely bad idea or whatever. I mean, God says, why are you living in your paneled houses?
Yes.
What about the temple? So it's not like he didn't want the temple or he didn't want them to re-covenant.
Mm-hmm.
We're just saying that those things don't guarantee this revival. Is that
Yeah, that's right. It's very similar to the origins of the kingdoms back like in the story of Saul, right? Where the people asked we want a king like all the other nations. And so was that a good request? Well, it was with bad motives. And so God says, yeah, and by the way they've made that request, they show they've rejected wanting me as their king. But at the same time, was having a line of kings against God's will. It doesn't seem like that. There was a law about how the kings were to behave in the book of Deuteronomy. So God anticipated. Right? The king from the line of Judah. So it's more about, this really gets into sovereignty, free will, but it's about the way the story presents it. Every generation has a crack at being the fulfillment, so to speak. And every generation in the biblical story disqualifies itself in some way. And so we are now looking back with the vantage point of having the interpretation of the prophets over all of it to say, yeah, none of that was the ultimate fulfillment. But of course, the people in those moments didn't know that. They were just trying to be faithful or not faithful, right, in what they were. And so I think, that's realistic, and that's realistic to our own situation, right? The way the promises about the return of Jesus work is that it could happen any moment. So follow Jesus with everything you've got. So it could happen any moment and you have no control over that. So follow Jesus with everything you've got. As if you know what I'm saying? So even though you have no control over the outcome of our events, that doesn't mean we sit around and do nothing. And I think that's the similar thing here. And you never know how God might orchestrate the efforts of his people, even despite his people, to do remarkable things in history to bring the kingdom of God. And so, I think so it's not casting a negative glance on the second temple, but it is saying, that sure didn't go very well. Yeah.
Tim, do you have any advice in how we talk through the tension between fulfillment and, remaining expectation? So that prophetic book package is so helpful. We're all kind of leaning forward, looking to Jesus to fulfill all those new covenant promises. still 2,000 years later with this sense of a need for revival
Yes.
among us. So it's kind of already not yet peace.
Yep.
Those who advise us to
Man, well, welcome to New Testament theology, right? So the question is, how do you address in Jesus, much has been fulfilled, but we're still awaiting the fulfillment. And so in many ways, we're in a similar circumstance. So yeah, that's just, it's the line that all of the apostles were navigating these churches through when they wrote those letters. So we have the gift of the Spirit, and we've been adopted from every race into the covenant family of Abraham. But you have to keep in step with the Spirit. The Spirit will change your heart, but you have to let the Spirit do it. You know? And so it's the God will fulfill his promises no matter what, but we play a role in how pleasant or unpleasant the ride will be for our part on the ride. And it's that same interplay of sovereignty and freedom that the Bible refuses to dissolve with a philosophical formula. And it forces every generation to see themselves as potentially on the eve of the great fulfillment. And so we don't sit around and do nothing. It's the opposite. We give everything we've got. And it might turn out like this. And you have no control over that. Or it might turn into something great, and we have no control over that. But that's not our job, is it? To orchestrate history. It's not our job. Our job is to be faithful, even when things are really a mixed result like this. And so I think that's the realism and the wisdom of Ezra-Nehemiah.